This video lesson is about glucose regulation and diabetes mellitus, and here are your objectives. The pancreas is the organ that is most involved in glucose regulation, and the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. Endocrine functions means that it produces and secretes hormones. The exocrine function is where it secretes things, but not into the blood like the hormones in the endocrine function, but it secretes into the intestine. And the pancreas sits here, sort of nestled underneath the stomach, and it connects to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And because it is there just emptying into the small intestine, it can empty things into the gut, and that includes enzymes which help to break down fats and starches and proteins, and it also secretes bicarbonate, which is basic and helps to neutralize the acidic digested or partially digested food that's coming from the stomach. So the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions, and we're going to talk now about the endocrine or hormone functions. So again, here is the pancreas, and then it looks like this, kind of like a flag, and within it there are these structures, combinations of cells that are called islets of Langerhans. Langerhans being the person most associated with discovering them. And these islets of Langerhans contain two important kinds of cells. There are actually other kinds of cells as well, but we're going to look at these, called alpha and beta cells, and these are the Greek symbols. Most of these cells here in this picture of an islet of Langerhans are beta cells, and then there are some other ones, maybe about 20% are alpha cells. So about 80% actually are beta cells, about 20% are alpha cells, and they secrete the hormones that are responsible for glucose regulation. Beta cells in these islets within the pancreas secrete insulin, and alpha cells secrete glucagon. Insulin secreted by the beta cells has the effect of decreasing blood glucose. And it does that by allowing cells to take up glucose from the blood. So after you eat a meal and you digest and then absorb the glucose, it's circulating in your bloodstream, but it can't actually get into your body cells without a kind of key, and insulin is that key that lets the blood glucose into the cells. And actually it does that by having the cells insert a glucose transporter into the cell membrane. So insulin secreted from the beta cells in the pancreas decreases blood glucose by allowing cells to take up glucose. Glucagon, on the other hand, increases blood glucose. And it does that by a variety of means, including stimulating the breakdown of glycogen, breaking glycogen down into glucose, and also new glucose can be made as well from amino acids, for example. So insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones. They act in opposite directions to regulate the blood sugar. Insulin from the beta cells decreases blood glucose, and glucagon from alpha cells increases blood glucose. And you actually have a little bit of both of them around at all times, and it's the balance of the two of them that dictates whether you are actively decreasing or increasing your blood glucose. Now we're going to focus on insulin in particular because it's a disruption in insulin signaling that results in high blood sugar, and that's characteristic of diabetes mellitus. So a disruption in insulin signaling can take place in a couple of different ways. You can either have a disruption of insulin production or secretion happening at the beta cells. Right, that would happen at the beta cells, which are the cells in the pancreas that are producing and secreting insulin. Or the beta cells can be okay, and insulin can be produced and secreted okay, but the target cells, the ones that are supposed to hear the message of insulin and let blood out of the bloodstream and into the cells might not be responding. So a disruption in either of these two places can lead to high blood sugar and the condition known as diabetes mellitus. And this, in fact, allows us to categorize diabetes into two different types based on their cause. First, there's type 1 diabetes, which makes up about 10% of all diabetes, whereas the more common type 2 diabetes makes up the other 90%. Neither of these conditions is particularly rare. Type 1 diabetes is not rare, but type 2 diabetes is very common. Type 1 diabetes results from an interruption of the production and secretion of insulin. And what has happened there is that the immune system has actually attacked the beta cells. So that's called autoimmune destruction, where your immune system effectively gets confused and starts attacking your own body. And in this case, that autoimmune destruction occurs to the beta cells. And so the beta cells get destroyed, and therefore there is little or ultimately no insulin. And this typically happens in childhood. So type 1 diabetes used to be called juvenile onset diabetes. And the treatment, because there is no insulin, is to give insulin in injections, or now it can be given in a pump, which manages those for you. So type 1 diabetes results from autoimmune destruction of the beta cells. There's little to no insulin, and therefore you treat it with insulin. In type 2 diabetes, in contrast, the problem is at the target cells, not so much at the pancreas itself, at least at first. And so this is a condition often referred to as insulin resistance. What has happened here is that insulin in the blood may be at normal or often even high levels, but the cells don't respond normally. So the cells of the body don't respond normally to the insulin, and so they don't take glucose up from the blood in response to the insulin as they normally would. And the typical age of onset here is in adulthood. And it is typically associated with overweight and obesity. And it is as the proportion of the North American population that is overweight or obese has increased, so has the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And so here the treatment is not insulin injections, at least at first, because often insulin can actually be normal or high in the blood as the pancreas tries to compensate for the failure of the target cells to respond. So the initial treatment is typically diet, exercise, and attempts at weight loss. And that can be supplemented as needed with oral medications that can help to sensitize the cells to insulin. And sometimes, as the pancreas gets kind of tired out, as the person has diabetes, type 2 diabetes for a while, the pancreas can start to get tired out of trying to overproduce insulin, and it kind of burns out, and then insulin levels actually drop. And when that happens, then people with type 2 diabetes can require insulin as well. So type 2 diabetes, the disturbance is at the target cells, the onset is in adulthood, it's associated with overweight and obesity, and the treatment starts with diet, exercise, and weight loss, and then medications as needed. Let's now look at the complications if the diabetes is uncontrolled and goes on for a long time. If it goes on for a long time, then the chronic complications are basically related to damage to the blood vessels. And blood vessels in various parts of the body get affected. So I'll draw some glasses here. The eyes are affected. The retina of the eyes has many small blood vessels, and when those are affected, then vision can be affected, and blindness can even result. The underlying cause of heart attacks and strokes, there's a symbol for a heart and a brain, is the same. Heart attacks and strokes are caused by atherosclerosis, which is a process of deposition of plaques in the walls of the arteries, and atherosclerosis is worsened or contributed to by diabetes. So heart attacks and strokes are common complications. The blood vessels around the nerves can get damaged as well, and so people can, for example, lose sensation in their feet. And the blood vessels in the kidneys get affected, and so diabetes is a leading cause of kidney failure. So the chronic complications are widespread and can often be severe. That's in the case of type 2 diabetes. And in type 2 diabetes, people often, when they are diagnosed, get diagnosed by a lab test and are feeling pretty fine. So you can imagine that it can be pretty hard to convince yourself that it's time to diet, exercise, try and lose weight, take a bunch of medications to try and avoid these complications in future when right now you're feeling fine. In type 1 diabetes, the chronic complications can be all of the same if the diabetes goes untreated for a long time. But people with type 1 diabetes can also get a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis. And this is not a chronic complication, not one that takes a long time, but one that happens acutely, one that can make you very sick very quickly. And what happens here is that in the absence of insulin, the body starts breaking down fats because it thinks it's starving. There's glucose in the bloodstream, but there's no glucose getting into the cells, so the body acts as if it's starving and starts breaking down fats to keep the brain fed into something called ketone bodies. And those ketone bodies, ultimately, as they build up, make the blood acidic. And so people can get this condition called ketoacidosis, where their blood pH becomes too low, and a bunch of other things happen as well, and they can get very, very sick acutely. That's different from these chronic complications. This is a case where people get sick right now and can die from this if it is not identified and treated. So that is an overview of glucose regulation and a look at the similarities and differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In both types, the ultimate problem that results is high blood sugar that results in all these complications. But the underlying cause is different. In type 1 diabetes, it's autoimmune destruction of the beta cells, and in type 2 diabetes, it's insulin resistance.